Hey, everybody. It's Amy Walter, editor in chief of the Cook Political Report. You're listening to The Odd Years, a political podcast designed for the off years, literally the odd numbered years where there are no scheduled federal elections. Last week, I talked with Democratic pollster Anna Greenberg. Anna is a senior partner of the polling firm GQR and in 2022 polled for a number of high profile House and Senate campaigns, including Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona, Senator Michael Bennett from Colorado, and Congresswoman Kim Schrier from suburban Seattle. Anna and I started with a conversation about why some polls, including some by Democrats, overestimated Republican strength in 2022 and the role abortion and the Dobbs decision played for Democrat successes last year. We also talked 2024 and why she thinks, regardless of who the GOP nominee may be, the Republican Party remains defined by Trump. And finally, we talk about the issue of crime and how, in Anna's words, Democrats are, quote, too scared of the left and they're too scared of the right. Here's our conversation. So, Anna, let's start in 2022. Take a look back for a second. You weren't surprised by Democrats' stronger than expected showing, and tell us why that is.
Well, I wasn't. I think for probably three reasons. The first, of course, was the Dobbs decision. You can't imagine a more sort of, shock to a system that, would upend. It's hard to imagine something being as impactful as Dobbs. And so the idea that we wouldn't update our thinking about what was going to happen in 2022 in response to Dobbs feels like madness. But there were other real world indicators beyond polling post Dobbs that suggested Democratic engagement. And so the first was, we saw a big bump in voter registration among younger people, especially younger women. We had a series of special elections where Democrats overperformed partisanship. We had the Kansas initiative around abortion, which wasn't just defeated, but overwhelmingly defeated with incredibly high turnout. And one of the things that, I'm a pollster, right? And so I tend to think that the polling data is one of the most important things to consider. But, there always are other things you can look at. In the lead up to 2018, we saw very similar dynamics where Democrats were overperforming in specials, high turnout in primaries, lots of Democratic challengers outraising incumbents. We saw the same things post Dobbs. And so it just stood to reason that Democrats were going to be engaged. And that was especially true in states where there were abortion bans. And you saw that Democrats in Arizona, for example, or Georgia or Wisconsin or places like that were even more engaged than, say, places like New Jersey or New York, where, abortion rights were secure. The final thing I would just say is that the fundamentals matter. And we don't see a lot of change from cycle to cycle among demographic groups. Absolutely, Hispanic voters in certain parts of the state in 2020 underperformed for Democrats. But generally speaking, we know how voters behave. And so when polls are coming in and people are reading it to be very conservative in anticipation of a wave, you start seeing the underlying data behaving weirdly. So I'll just give you an example.
Yeah.
I was shown a poll in the race for Senate in Arizona, and in that data, Mark Kelly was losing, which I did Mark Kelly's polling and he was never losing. And so when you look underneath the hood, you could see he was only getting like 51% of Hispanic voters, which doesn't make any sense at all, given that he did extremely well with Hispanic voters in 2020. And Blake Masters couldn't be a more off-putting candidate in general, but certainly to Hispanic voters. And so I just think for all of those reasons, understanding the shock of Dobbs, looking at the non-polling indicators of Democratic energy, and then looking at the internals of these polls that were clearly too conservative and just things basically not making sense. That somehow the fundamentals went out the window because people were so worried about getting it wrong. So that's a long-winded answer, but that's why.
Okay, so let's break this down just a little bit. We had, it seemed, two big factors beyond Dobbs. So you have that as, you're right, a shakeup to the fundamentals. We also had a 40-year high inflation. And we had something that, again, most people under the age of 50 had not seen before. So wasn't so much of it trying to balance out which of these things was going to be the more salient in this, and that at the end of the day, a bunch of pollsters, including a lot of Democrats, were telling us abortion rights only took us so far. it's the economy that's going to ultimately
Mhm.
matter in the end. Why didn't you see that?
Because our politics post Trump are different,
Mm,
and partisan polarization and ideological battles matter more than the economy. And I don't know if we'll go back to a world where, performance in what is it, the first quarter of the election year, whatever
right.
the quarter is that says if you're a recession in that quarter, you're going to lose. Can
Right.
we go back to a time when economic indicators were predictors of electoral outcomes? But we're not in that moment right now. And I think the existential threat of Republicans to Democrats, as it was embodied in Dobbs, but it wasn't just Dobbs, drove turnout, drove voting Democratic, it drove particularly independent women. Well, I mean, the gender gap with independents is huge. Independent women voting heavily Democratic. And those mattered more. Being scared about what was going to happen to the country for the folks who voted Democratic mattered more than inflation.
On the abortion issue, I want to ask you this question looking at it from two ways. The first is, as we were just talking about, there seemed to be a split, not just in the sort of broader political class, but even within Democratic ranks about the salience of abortion versus the economy, with Bernie Sanders and some folks from that camp saying Democrats screwed up before the election. Democrats screwed up. They should be talking more about the economy. But I'm wondering if you could also address that looking through the lens of gender, and specifically if you noticed among your peers in the consultancy world on the Democratic side, if women who still there are still not enough women who are partners and principals in consulting firms, pollsters, media consultants, etc.
Right.
If women viewed this differently than their male counterparts.
Absolutely. But let me
Hmm.
start with the first part of your question, which is
Yeah.
a lot of the commentary from Washington about what Democrats were doing wrong in their campaigns had no relationship to what was actually happening in campaigns. We ran ads on the economy. We ran ads on crime in all of my races. And if I had to hear one more person say, Democrats aren't talking about the economy when we have chips and supply chain and, infrastructure, I'll go back to Mark Kelly, every third ad is on the economy. And so the first thing is that a lot of the commentary, literally, I think people who are safe in their seats and not up in
Mm.
cycle literally don't know what's on TV or what's going in the mail or what's being said at the doors in
Or
races.
they're not realizing that your campaign is actually spending most of its money talking about those issues, but
Right.
outside groups may be driving the
Sure.
abortion or they're running ads about other stuff. It's not
Sure.
you and your campaign. Right.
Sure. But that's very complicated because,
Yes.
as you know, there are signals sent to outside groups about what you would like to see on TV. And so that I actually think that the IE spending was pretty on the mark
Mm.
too.
Okay.
But leaving that aside, I do think there was the notion. I do believe that sexism and misogyny are a big part of underestimating the role of abortion. And some of it is that Democrats have been trained for years that they shouldn't talk about it. Even though the majority of this country is pro-choice and has been since 1972, there's been little dips here and there, but fundamentally, somewhere between 50 and 60% of people in this country are pro-choice and have been since Roe v. Wade was decided. And so there's this lack of confidence that Democrats have had, and they found ways of talking about it to sort of soften it up. Reproductive health care, right? Using those kinds of phrases, abortion care, using these kinds of phrases when in fact, most people just think women should have the right to control their own body. And they certainly think that whether it's an issue of the woman's health or, whether or not the fetus can survive outside of the womb, but, there rape, incest, when I did focus groups, actually pre-Dobbs, because it turns out stuff in Texas was pretty well known nationally. I was kind of shocked to have people bring up the Texas law from earlier in the year before pre-Dobbs. But when you did the focus groups with, obviously most of the focus groups I do are with kind of independent, leaning conservative folks, because that's who we're trying to get. And the women in these groups could have been clearer. They're taking away women's rights, trying to control my body. And these were feminists, and some of these were Trump voters. And so I think that a lot of, and I'll say this, a lot of male consultants are used to not talking about abortion, to using it only in very targeted ways. We'll do a direct mail piece to a suburban college educated woman, but she must be the only person who cares about it, right? And so that, in my experience, at the beginning of Dobbs was very much the attitude is, well, maybe we can use it in these limited ways, as opposed to it being the earthquake that it was. Now, to be fair, I think by September, everybody knew. There might have been people saying we shouldn't be, but in the campaign world, everybody knew it was all abortion all the time. And there was very little pushback. But when Dobbs first came down, there was a lot of skepticism. And just as a human being, I'm like, guys, this is like huge. This is everything. This is how you start taking away women's rights. I mean, why do you think people are going to be like, yeah, it's just this little niche issue? I don't understand it at all.
Was surprised too, at maybe shouldn't have been listening in on focus groups. And again, this was usually women, but sometimes men too, who would say things like, well, I'm pro life, but,
Mhm.
right? I didn't think that meant no one could have an abortion. I meant it for me. I don't think it's right. I morally disagree with it, but I wasn't asking for people to just like get rid of Roe v. Wade. And so we sort of
yeah.
interpreted as well what it meant to be people who are self-identifying as pro-life. We thought we knew what that meant, but actually didn't.
Yeah, and in fact, there was some really good research that we did with NARAL a number of years ago where I'm sure you saw this, had this 70% number.
Yeah.
Is that there are people who were pro-choice under all or most circumstances, and there were people who said, I'm personally opposed, but I think other people should have that right. And it was 70%. Guess what? That's actually, there are very few people who say no, we should be able to have abortions, and even fewer who say cases of rape, incest, life of the mother, non-viable fetus. So I think that's exactly right.
So when we talk about polling now going forward, one of the challenges that you have, and I'd love for you to dig into this for a second and help our listeners understand this, is uh, creating basically a model, what you think the turnout is going to look like, who's going to come out and vote. And can you talk to us a little bit as you think ahead to 2024, based on what you've learned from,
Sure.
as you said, this era in the post-Trump era that we're
Yeah.
in, or I don't know what we're in. Are we still in the Trump era, the post-Trump era?
I think we're definitely still in the Trump era. As long as Trump is running for president and, the other people running, with very few exceptions, will not say his name or, critique him, we're in the Trump era. It's possible he loses the primary and we have a different person, but we're still in the Trump era. Absolutely.
Really? You do think so? Even if there is so we'll just throw out Ron DeSantis, um, just being different from Donald Trump is not enough to maybe change the constituencies of the two parties?
Trump wasn't just a person who mobilized a set of people. He was a distillation and almost a cult-like figure of a certain set of Republicans who came to dominate the party. And now the conflict between the parties is about like existential, issues. Is not about I'm for lower taxes, I'm for higher taxes. And as long as that is true of the Republican Party, which everybody from McCarthy, who's given the January 6th footage, to Tucker Carlson, to, Sununu saying, I'll vote for Trump if he's the nominee, as long as that's where the Republican Party is, there'll be a set of people mobilized to support them, and also a reaction from Democrats who are mobilized to fight that. And so that happened in 2022. Absolutely happened in 2022, even though Trump wasn't on the ballot. Even though there were some things that happened like Mar-a-Lago that kind of inserted him into
January 6th hearings.
January 6th, exactly. But the point is Trump, it's more Trumpism than Trump himself. I think Democrats are terrified of the Republicans, and it motivates them to come out to vote. And Dobbs, was that's part of the reason. It wasn't just that Dobbs was taking away women's rights, self-determination, but it was like the best example of how scary and dangerous, for them, that, I'm a Democrat. So in my view, Republicans are, and I don't see that abating. But let's go back to your polling question.
Yeah.
Shall we?
Yeah.
So
this is great.
So what the Trump era means is high turnout.
Yeah.
And we've now had 3 elections with high turnout. We also had high turnout in the off year in Virginia and New Jersey, if you compared 2021 to 2017. So that's 4 cycles of high turnout. When you think about developing a poll, you have to have a model of what you think the electorate's going to look like. And that involves a variety of assumptions about who's going to come out to vote. We do not have crystal balls. We can't predict who's going to come out to vote. And so the polling misses, even though a lot of people talked about shy Trump voters and not taking surveys, the truth is a lot of them were not in the surveys in the first place. So as an example, there are people who did not vote in 2012. It was an easy reelect for Obama, who got motivated to vote for Trump in 2016. They weren't new voters. They weren't 18. They weren't people who just, voted for the first time. But when we think about who might vote in presidential elections, if you were eligible and hadn't voted in the past, we have no reason to believe you're going to vote in the future. So in both 2016 and in 2020, Trump brought new people into the electorate.
That's right.
And they were different. Like it was much more like a white blue collar thing in 2016, and they voted again. But then you had a huge number of new Hispanic voters in 2020. And so the polls were wrong in part because new people came out to vote. And so I don't expect anyone to feel sorry for pollsters, but I do feel like there should be a little bit of sympathy around, nobody knew that Trump was going to find 1 million new voters in 2020. And I don't know why anyone thinks pollsters know 1 million new people. So some of the polling misses were missing people in the first place. And you have to know who you're calling or who you're sending an email to, or you're sending a text to. It's got to be an identifiable person. And if you don't know they're going to vote, you don't ever contact them in the first place.
Are you under the belief that many pollsters were after 2020 that even though the sample looked correct, right? You say, oh, this many Republicans, this many white voters without a college degree, this many rural voters, et cetera, while their profile looked like a Trump voter, the kinds of people who were responding to surveys from those areas were more likely to be skeptical of Trump than they were the hardcore supporters of Donald Trump. In other words, they weren't shy. It wasn't that they were lying to you guys. It's that, as you said, you didn't find them, not because you weren't looking for them, but because you thought you found them, but you didn't.
Right. They were the wrong. We found people who were going to vote. We just didn't find, all of them. I have never seen real definitive evidence that the kinds of Republicans in our surveys were the less conservative Republicans, and therefore we underestimated Trump's support. And I think that the way I work is, first of all, to make sure I have the right number of Republicans in my survey in the first place, which is to say, I know it has to be, say, 35% registered Republicans while I'm calling. If it's coming in 20%, I will say to my calling house, you're only calling Republicans. Now, that's expensive. Right. And so it's much easier just to let it fall out how it falls out and wait it. But if you wait unrepresentative data, it is still unrepresentative data. The only thing that waiting fixes, and I don't know if your listeners know what waiting is, but it's adjusting the sample after you finish to make sure you're accurately reflecting the demographic and kind of political. What we know, political is a little harder, but certainly the demographics of the population that you're surveying. And so if we don't have enough registered Republicans, we would just wait it up. But if you wait up unrepresentative data, it doesn't make it.
It's going to make it. Yeah.
It actually highlights.
It actually highlights that problem. That's exactly right.
Yeah. And then the other thing is, it may or may not be true, but how do you know? Like, what are you going to wait on? You're going to make them, are you going to wait them and make them on the self-reported ideology more conservative? Or one tactic is to ask your affect towards the NRA, something like that, and then wait people to make them like the NRA more. But like, how do you really know? These are all fake. Not fake. These are also, public opinion is a social construct. People don't walk around with opinions in their head. And so when you start doing that, you really are imposing your own ideas of what you think they might think. And you don't want to do that.
Right. So it seems that one of the challenges then for 2024, we kind of get back to the same scenario where, look, we know, as you pointed out, there is a constituency out there for Democrats that has come out 2018, 2020, and 2022 to vote against Donald Trump and what he stands for. Will that same constituency show up? We talked about if Trump's not on the ballot, or two, if there is, well, let's just say without Trump on the ballot, you still think he will the promise or the prospect of this Republican Party sort of built in his image is enough to get those voters out?
I don't know, but I think so.
Mm.
And some of it, if you look back on 2022 and you look at turnout, turnout was highest in competitive states and
Yeah.
districts, obviously, but also in states that had the same kind of dynamic: Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin. I mean, there were competitive congressional races in New Jersey and New York that had lower turnout than 2018.
Right.
And then you had statewide races and congressionals in a place like Arizona where they met 2018, which was mind-blowingly high. And so in 2022, we're seeing places where Trump himself wasn't on the ballot, but Trumpism was, and you saw very high turnout. I know Brian Kemp won, but obviously Warnock was reelected and Mark Kelly was reelected and Evers was reelected. And we could talk about the Wisconsin Senate. I think that was complicated. But there was a lot of evidence in the places where you had that kind of existential battle. Turnout was quite high. We haven't even talked about Biden. So
Yeah, that's
right.
where I was going next is
So I don't know in that sense what happens. But if the idea of Trumpism and that kind of existential threat that it poses to many people, and then I just want to say one more thing about it. There's a lot of anger on the Republican side, and that angry narrative doesn't seem to be changing. And so if you listen to Ron DeSantis, who is obviously much more polished than Trump and isn't, at least at the moment, trying to subvert democracy, he's not autocrat. That speech from Trump at CPAC was pretty darn scary. But he's very angry about transgender people, very angry about CRT. He's very angry at Disney. I mean, there's a lot of, and a lot of the Republican advertising in 2022 was, we're all going to die, apocalypse. And I still feel that from them. And that's very off putting. And so they don't seem to be changing that. And there's like literally, for my candidates, I said, we have to have at least one track of positive on TV because what's coming from the Republicans is so unrelentingly pessimistic,
right.
that
Right.
they want people to vote for us because they think we're not. Like, we want America. We're into America doing better and have some ideas about that. And you know what I mean? So I think the dynamic will still be there, but there's known unknowns and unknown unknowns, to quote Donald
I
Trump
know
still.
it's still my favorite, Anna. That is still one of my favorite quotes that Donald Trump's
It's so
quote because it's so perfect for politics. There literally
Totally.
are known unknowns, right? We know that this is going to be an issue, but I don't know how it's going to play out. So,
exactly.
let's talk about President Biden and your perception about first these polls that we've seen where you have Democratic voters saying, yeah, I like Joe Biden. I think he's doing a good job. Then the next question is, would you like to see him run for reelection? No, I'd like to see someone else. Help us understand what you think Democratic voters are saying there.
Mhm. So look, I think that when Joe Biden was elected in 2020, people coalesced around him because I think they believed quite accurately he was probably the only person who could beat Donald Trump.
Right.
And that's a totally legitimate reason to vote for someone for your nominee for president. I'm biased. I think he's been a really good president in terms of just overall accomplishments and the ability to he's gotten more done than Obama did in 8 years and 3. So I think, or 2.5. So I think he's been a good president. But I think that nobody's immune from the narrative that is spread through social media and the dark web about dementia and all that sort of thing. I mean, he doesn't have dementia. You can listen to him talk. He trips over himself. He's always done that. But at any rate, no one's immune from that. People think everyone's too old, right? And that's fine.
But even among Democratic leaning focus groups Anna, that I listen to, what comes up is all the same things you mentioned. They're not saying he has dementia, but they are saying 82.
No, exactly.
And he seems slower and
Totally.
he walks slower and
Yeah.
his face looks older and, it's there. So is
Absolutely.
that what's driving most of this? And what does it mean?
I believe it is driving because there isn't anything he's done substantively or in policy terms that anybody in the Democratic Party disagrees with. So this is very much about that impression they have of him being too old. And what I was going to say is, if he's running, short of some medical event, he's going to be the nominee. Democrats are going to rally. And so I think that Republicans are, when I hear Republicans talk about, well, they don't really want him, it's like, you know what? Especially if he's running against Trump or DeSantis or the existential threat of Trumpism, people are going to vote for him enthusiastically. So I don't worry as much about that. I worry more about the unknown unknowns, right? So, for example, let's say China decides to give weapons to Russia, and we're in World War III.
Right.
I don't know how that's going to,
Right.
Biden.
I please don't let that happen. But
I would like that
yes.
not to happen. Say at the beginning of next year, we finally are in a recession, right? And so, those are the kinds of things that would affect, I think, independent voters and their support for Biden. But I don't see Democrats, they will be enthusiastic supporters of him if he is the Democratic nominee.
So let's then talk about what you think the campaign should be leaning into as they're going into 2024, or whether it's the Biden campaign or outside groups. Is this message of making sure that voters know, regardless who's on the top of the ballot, the Republican nominee is going to just be an extension of Trumpism? And if so, when does that branding
Mhm.
need to start happening?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the benefits that Biden has anyway, if we think about this in presidential terms, is at the moment he doesn't have a primary.
Right.
And so you kind of want to let them fight it out with each other, right? That's going to set kind of the narratives for the Republicans. And so far, it's been very gentle. I mean, at least not on Trump's part, but everyone keeps commenting on the fact that no Republican says the word, Trump, right? So at some point, they're all going to like lay out and let him be the nominee, or something's going to happen where he's challenged. So there's a certain part of, for Democrats is to stand back and let them do that. The other thing I think, and I don't have a good answer on this, is there's something going on with, think about DeSantis, think about what his legislative agenda, and it's not just, sex education and transgender and woke capitalism. It's also, I'm sure you, as a journalist, saw all the stuff he wants to do around free speech and lowering the threshold for defamation. And how do we talk about that? You know, and because most people are worried about what's happening day to day, right? And so their day to day lives, like how much does it cost for a tank of gas? But this to me is, there's potentially something very powerful in an overall narrative about what this is, which, ultimately, if you listen to Trump, it's autocracy, it's fascism. And it's not what our country's about. And that plus the kind of isolationist America first, I think is very, it's at least not in a way that anyone could articulate, but it's part of why so many people are scared of Republicans. But we haven't figured out a good way to even talk about January 6th. So I would like someone to hire me
This is a pitch to anyone. Yes.
to really dig into this stuff, because there's something there that we have not been able to really articulate in a way outside of very progressive circles, but I think is a quite powerful contrast. And it may be the right contrast with DeSantis.
Well, that was the argument that President Biden made in 2022, was that democracy was on the ballot. We talked a lot about Dobbs. He, of course, mentioned that too, but really his emphasis was as much about January 6th and about protecting democracy than anything else. And as we discussed, there was some disagreement even within Democratic circles about whether that was whether that was the right message. He
But
sort
then
of
it
had the
showed up
last
in the exit
laugh.
polls, though.
That's right.
Exactly. We did 2 post-election polls,
Yeah.
and we asked open-ended, "Why did you vote Democratic?" And democracy was, it was abortion and democracy, and not one of my campaigns ran an ad on democracy. People figured it out.
This also seems to me that the Dobbs decision is part and parcel about that, right? Because if your concern is things are getting rolled back, my rights are getting rolled back, Dobbs fits into that model, right? Which is, whether it's about the issue of abortion is one thing, but and I would hear this in focus groups as well. Well, it starts with abortion and then it's going to go right? Down the list, gay marriage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Um, and you didn't have to say anything about January 6th because it was everywhere in the
But
media.
people, I mean, as you say, Biden was criticized for it.
Mhm.
Um, but in fact, people who voted Democratic sort of got it on their own. And, you know, people got Dobbs, pretty quickly on their own. You know what I mean? Like we all think we're so smart, in Washington, that giving message advice to campaigns, but voters sometimes just kind of get it. And they certainly, these again, voters who vote Democratic kind of got it. But I think you're right. I think it is tied up in Dobbs, but it's also this, there's like, there's self-determination and privacy. And, I think, accusing parents who give gender affirming care of child abuse, attacking children. There's just all of this stuff is very ugly, right? And certainly overturning marriage equality, which is what I think will be coming next in some places, an attempt to do that. And I don't, given how the court repudiated Roe, and even though Alito said they're not, explicitly said we're not going over marriage equality, Claire Sum was like, I don't know about that. Um, and so I do think this is a harder argument to make, but it is part and parcel of kind of authoritarianism is, you know, control of corporations, ironically, right? That's what the going after woke capitalism is actually the government trying to control what corporations, private companies do. And then you're also trying to control private individuals. This is very undemocratic. And so, again, I don't have the words for how to talk about this with voters who are worried about, you know, how much their prescription drugs cost. And that's legitimate. But I think that's something we need to figure out.
Final question is about another issue that comes up a lot when we hear talk about Democrats and things that they should be thinking a lot more about, which is as a worry, which is the crime issue. And that after the 2020 election, you had a lot of Democrats who said, hey, we got defined by the defund the police rhetoric, and we better watch out because we're going to lose elections if we're seen as the party that's soft on crime. And now, as we speak, there's a debate going on uh, in Congress about voting against a DC crime bill with, it looks like, many Democratic senators joining Republicans on this. Talk to us about the crime issue and how
Sure.
you think it plays.
Mhm. Sure. I mean, I think this is a really, really important conversation. And I think Democrats have got it wrong, but not in the way that I think the conventional wisdom would suggest. And I think the reason Democrats have got it wrong is they're too scared of the left and they're too scared of the right. When in fact, most Democrats, including the president, represent the absolute mainstream, middle of the road opinion about crime, which is one, people deserve public safety, and two, people deserve, particularly people of color, not to be discriminated against and killed by police. You can hold both those views at the same time. They are not in contradiction with each other, right? And so when I say they're too scared of the left, there's a very, very small number of people, a very small number of activists who coined defund. It is not something that is ever talked about outside of that very small group of activists. The Republicans and the media, as they're that have been complicit, have suggested that this is like a Democratic position. I mean, the president said, fund the police, remember? And so I just don't think Democrats should worry about talking about, supporting police, right? I just don't. And I think that they will get blowback on Twitter and on Facebook and on Instagram. But when it comes to voters, the people actually determine election outcomes, that's where most people are. And that are too scared of the right because, when you talk to people about crime, they don't say the number one reason crime's gone up is because Democrats are defunding the police. That's not what they say. Now, they may say, I'm worried that some police won't go to certain neighborhoods or won't really enforce the law because they're worried about complaints. You hear a little bit of that, but you also hear poverty, the proliferation of guns, a lot of discussion of bad parents, bring back spanking and corporal punishment, I hear often. Bad schools. It's multi-causal and people know it. And
Right.
so when you have a very simplistic that says Democrats are anti-police, one for that's of crime, people are like, yeah, that's not really how I think about crime. And I'll give you an example, which is New Mexico. I work for the governor of New Mexico. crime is very bad in New Mexico, especially Albuquerque, legitimately, and has been for a long time. I mean, apparently everyone's car gets stolen in Mexico. Like, it's a very common thing that everybody's car gets stolen. They ran 25 ads on crime against her. We ran 4 crime response ads, 4 to 25. And the crime ads never affected her standing one bit. And when we did, literally her share of the vote and her favorability and job performance didn't move the entire election cycle, which is also a little humbling when you work in campaigns and like nothing changes no matter what you do.
Right.
At least when you're on the winning side, it's fine. When you're on the losing side and nothing changes, it's pretty frustrating after spending millions and millions of dollars. But nothing really changed. And we did focus groups. I mean, again, this is New Mexico. It's a more Democratic state, more Hispanic state. It's a poor state. But there's a lot of discussion of poverty and lack of job opportunity as the root of crime in Albuquerque, in New Mexico. And so when the ads are saying, she's going to get you killed because she doesn't fund police, that's like kind of people just don't believe it, right? It's not plausible. And so again, I don't think Democrats should be scared of the right on this. And I think in general, that everyone has everyone's slightly different from each other, but most Democrats, most electeds have that kind of middle of the road that, what I call is protect and respect. And, and I think that they should be competent and not worry about the blowback. And the other thing I would just say is Democrats did run ads on crime in 2022. And that's another thing that annoyed me so much about the commentary. I worked, for Congressman Cartwright and Congresswoman Schrier, and both those races, we ran multiple ads about police funding. Congressman Schrier did police ride-alongs. Mark Kelly ran ads. Mark Kelly's parents are cops. I mean, so the notion that Democrats didn't deal with crime in their campaigns is also not true.
I think it's driven a lot, Anna, by the situation in New York, which New York always gets outsized attention because media is centered in New York, but that those races became defined by, and the governor's race defined as much by crime as anything else.
Okay.
And so as such, there we go. That's how that became part of the narrative. And did you do any races in New York?
I did. I did all of the for outside group. I didn't do any candidates, but I did all of those
So
races.
what was your take on how crime impacted those races?
So I don't want to say it didn't, but what I will say is Long Island and upstate New York have been, but especially Long Island, have been moving Republican for a while. This wasn't just a new thing. So in 2021, for example, there were a lot of county exec races and those kinds of races. And people were paying so much attention to Virginia and New Jersey, they didn't really say anything about New York. Democrats lost a lot on Long Island in 2021. Having worked in a lot of those districts in previous cycles, they're very tough. Long Island's more blue collar, realize the Hamptons a very small part of it. And so I think at least part of it is it's just a Republican area. You know what I mean? Fundamentally. And it's been moving that way for a long time. The one sort of caveat I would say is, bail reform in New York was a big deal, eliminating cash bail. And we all know why. I know why I'm for eliminating cash bail, but there's no question that it was deeply unpopular, that there were kind of Willie Horton-esque kind of cases of people being released without bail who then went on to commit heinous crimes. And so it's certainly possible because of that crime was, sort of elevated in New York. So I don't want to discount crime, but I do want to bring in that partisanship matters. And a place that's been trending Republican anyway for years is going to be a tougher terrain for Democrats. I would have to dig in more. I'd like to actually go back and see like what ads were run. But
yes,
it's a very expensive media market.
Well,
so
that's another piece of
it.
There. That's right.
Very few ads are run in New York.
And to your point that you made earlier, which was just the emphasis in certain states on abortion, where that was hot button issue, Arizona being one of those, versus New York, where it wasn't a topic because it's not an issue there. California, the same. So you saw huge drop off in California and New York, and you do wonder, okay, run those ads, run those campaigns in a quote unquote traditional turnout where you have, sort of, or presidential year turnout, let's call it.
Right.
Would they have the same effect?
It's a really good point.
We don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. No, turnout was down in those places. And maybe Democrats just didn't come out because they're like, yeah, abortion's legal in New York. It's legal in New Jersey. It's legal in California. And they just didn't come out. So it's very easy for people, for example, the mayor's race in Chicago, crime. I'm sorry, Lori Lightfoot was unpopular all 4 years. It may be growing. I'm not saying it isn't, but like understand what's actually happening in that city. She barely won the mayor election. She was the last person standing. It's literally the only reason she won. Every other person had a scandal. And so she was not a consensus choice. She was unpopular from day one. She was not a good mayor. And so, she lost convincingly. And like, it's crime. Democrats have a problem.
One of my favorite things about these interviews is the chance to ask a few fun questions of my guests. Here's Anna. All right, so this is a question we are asking all of our guests, which is the first elected official you met and interacted personally with.
Well, I don't remember because I probably met people quite young given my parents' careers. But the first one I really remember interacting with was Chris Dodd in 1980. I'm old. He was the congressman from the 2nd CD, which is kind of coastal, eastern Connecticut. And he was running for Senate. And my stepmother was his campaign manager. And so
Perfect.
there was a story that we heard them talking about Chris Dodd, who was going to come over to our house. And my sister thought they said Chris died. So we're all wondering, like, who died?
Who's Chris? And how did he die?
Who's Chris? Is he dead? But turns out it was Chris Dodd, and he was very much alive. And he was elected to the U.S. Senate. And so that's probably, and he's a wonderful, wonderful person who I've known for a very long time. And so that's probably the first politician I really interacted with.
The other question we like to ask folks, especially those in the world of political consulting, since this is called the odd years, the theory being that there are, even years where you have political elections and odd years where you don't. And the theory was, at least in the old days, that you got to relax in the odd year and the off year, and it was quieter. First, is that the case for you? And if so, what do you like to do with all of your free time? And if not, why not?
So it is slower, but it's not slow.
Mm.
And one, there are elections in the odd years. So I'm working in New Jersey and mayor's races. So I actually have elections in November and primaries and all that sort of stuff. So I have elections, but it's certainly slower, much, much less work. But on the other hand, you spend an enormous amount of time being stressed that nobody is ever going to hire you again. And so trying to find business, lots of lunches and drinks and coffees, lots of calling what you're hearing, who's going to run. And so there's like the kind of anxiety takes up a lot of time in the odd year.
Right. So this is not, I have some free time. Let's go to Europe.
No.
And, right. It is.
I need X number of clients.
Exactly. In order to pay the bills.
Yes, to pay my staff, I need X number of clients in 2024, and I will get by the skin of my teeth in the odd year, and then make all the money in the odd year and the on year. So yes, so there's a lot of anxiety. Now, I will say that I have taken up hiking, but the other thing that I have been doing, which my husband thinks I'm crazy, is I feel like I spend too much time on my phone while I'm watching TV and not paying attention to the show and not really chilling out. So now I'm doing needlepoint while I watch my shows.
So you're basically 87 years old.
Very old. I know, because 1980 is my first politician.
Well, do you have anything to share about your needle? Any needle
Really
points?
hurts my index finger. The needle, so I got to find a thimble. That's my.
That's very good.
A thimble of Amazon.
Are you making? Are you making pillows? Are you making coasters? What are you making? And are you sharing them?
I bought a very cheap 3-pack off Amazon to start because I didn't know how to do it. And I figured I'll do some where I mess it up. And then if I actually am okay at it, then I can figure something else out to do. So they're just flowers, wildflowers. So
now, and then the final one, are you binging a show currently? Or if not, what was your last favorite binge?
I'm always binging shows, not otherwise. And I will also reveal, along with my needlepoint, that I mostly watch British procedurals, and I'm on a Facebook page.
That's my mom.
That's for people who watch British shows. So yeah, I am 800 years old. So
literally, my mom is 82 years old, and that's
I just finished.
Her highlight.
I just finished all 12 seasons of Vera.
Okay, I'll
which I
have to
highly
ask about that.
recommend.
I'm sure she's already watched it.
Line of Duty, I've already finished. There's unlimited numbers of British procedurals out
Do
there.
you watch those together or you watch that alone?
I watch more TV than my husband, so
Mm,
we always have 2 shows, one that we're watching together and then one I'm watching on my own, and I tend to do a lot of those British procedurals by myself.
I got it. We need our private time. And
Mhm.
these devices are great that you can be in the
Yeah.
same house. Are you ever, this happens in our household, there's usually one show that all 3 of us will be watching, but for the most part, if you walked around our house, you would find 3
Yes.
different people watching 3 different things.
That
Same.
yes, there's 4 of us and sometimes 5, but my stepdaughter's in college now, but sometimes it's 5. We did all watch The Mandalorian together and loved it,
Same.
and I can't wait to watch the 2nd season, and Baby Yoda is my favorite.
And Baby Yoda, have you started it yet?
No, don't tell me
Okay.
anything.
Well, just Baby Yoda continues to be adorable. I will
Well,
say that.
that'll make me
I mean,
very
even
happy.
more adorable than normal. So that will be great.
Yes.
Thank you, Anna. Appreciate you taking all this time, Anna, to talk
My
through this
pleasure.
with me. It's been a lot of fun. And we still have so many unknowns yet to uncover. So I look forward
Unknown
to
unknowns.
unknown unknowns and known unknowns to uncover. So I look forward to doing
Yes.
that with you soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Bye. That's our show. Thank you so much for listening. In the weeks ahead, we'll be talking with the one and only Judy Woodruff of the PBS NewsHour. Be sure to follow The Odd Years on your favorite podcast platform, leave a review, and if you're a Cook Political Report subscriber, check out our exclusive bonus content at cookpolitical.com. See you next time on The Odd Years.